Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first ever Brains blog roundtable discussion. My name is Dan Burnston, and I'm one of the co-managing editors of the Brains blog, along with Nick Bird. And we've joined here today to have a sort of panel discussion about the field of perceptual representation and perceptual content. The purpose of these roundtables is to get some established and in many cases quite distinguished people in the field together to talk not necessarily informally, but a little bit less formally about the status of the field, how they see the field going, how the topics have changed and evolved over time, and what is inspiring people doing research in the field about the field as they work on it currently. So this is the first one. We're going to have a series of these, and I'm very happy that we've got some very distinguished panelists today. As I mentioned, the topic today is perceptual representation and perceptual content. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the field, broadly the idea here is that perception works by creating a representation of the environment, and those representations are describable in terms of their contents or what they say about the world, what they represent in the world. So representationalism, broadly speaking, has a long history in philosophy of perception, including thinking about the classic problem of perception, the way that perception relates to the world. But more recently has also played an important role in thinking about perceptual consciousness. So one might ask the question about the relationship between the qualitative character of perception and the representational content of perception. Also, importantly, it's been used more recently to think about the organization of perception and the nature of mental processing in perceptual systems. And this brings it into close contact with perceptual psychology and perceptual neuroscience. So it's an incredibly rich field, and I'm very excited for this to be our first roundtable, since we have three very highly productive and influential figures in the field today. So I want to introduce them to you now. I guess we'll just go in alphabetical order here. So Ned Block is the Silver Professor of Philosophy, Psychology, and Neuroscience at NYU. Has worked in philosophy and mind for a long time with very influential work in issues surrounding functionalism, consciousness, most pertinent for today, perceptual content and perceptual architecture. I guess you'd maybe call it the target of a recent book called Blockheads, which is a series of essays responding to your work, Ned. And also has if I understand correctly, a new book in the works. So Ned, thanks very much for joining us today. Next, we have Susanna Schellenberg, who is a distinguished professor of philosophy and cognitive science at Rutgers University. Actually, my alma mater. I went to undergraduate there, I think, before you arrived, and has done some really great and very exciting work on perceptual consciousness, perceptual capacities, on the nature of perceptual objects, and more recently on neuroscience and artificial intelligence, correct? So she wrote a very well-received book a couple of years ago called The Unity of Perception, and has a couple of forthcoming book projects in the works that hopefully we can get her to tell us about in a second. So Susanna, thanks very much for being here. And last but certainly not least, we have Susanna Siegel, who's the Edgar Pierce Professor of Philosophy at Harvard. Has done very major work in philosophy of perception. Specifically, I associate Susanna with the rich content view of perception. So the idea that perception can represent rich contents like causation, kinds, and affordances. And recently worked on the intersection of those questions with epistemology as systematized in her 2017 book, The Rationality of Perception, which I taught to my philosophy of perception class a couple of years ago. And we had a great time with it. So again, thank you all very much for being here. I'm very excited to have you. What I want to do now is I want to go and ask each of you in turn to tell us a little bit of something about your current work. So what is the project that you are excited about these days? And a little bit about why that project struck you as an important project to work on, given where the literature is on this topic. So Susanna Siegel, can we start with you, please?
Sure, thanks, Dan, for organizing this. I have a couple of projects I'm working on. One is about and they're both about perceptual consciousness in their own way. One is about the spontaneous flow of thought and how to theorize about its structure. So the spontaneous flow of thought is unplanned, uneffortful, unintentional, So it'll include things like attention capture when you like happen to notice a turtle or suddenly hear a loud bang. But it will also include cases where the flow of thought is informed by your standing mental states. And I'm arguing that the spontaneous flow of thought in those cases can become something that can be better or worse in all sorts of ways, including in epistemic ways. So rather than theorizing about perceptual experience in a kind of freeze frame way that's kind of characterized the field for a long time, I'm interested in the dynamics of the flow of thought and the changes in what can become salient to it. So that's one sort of project. And then the other thing I've been thinking a lot about is actually returning to the question of what kinds of things we can perceive, and asking whether we can perceive the public in the sense of the body politic, or whether instead we have to imagine it. So thinkers have thought about this sort of outside of the philosophy of perception in various ways. Walter Lippmann famously called the public a phantom. John Dewey worried that the public was nebulous and had to be made visible. And then in political theory, political theorists like Benedict Anderson have argued that nations are kind of fundamentally imagined communities. So these are all different ways of saying that you can't perceive the public, you can't perceptually experience it. But I think that's not right. I think that the idea that you can't perceive the public, you have to imagine it instead, is too quick, and that actually are ways to perceive the public. So I've been writing about what that kind of perceptual experience would be and its relation to both fascist and democratic political culture.
Fantastic, great. Yeah, that's all really exciting. There's a bunch of themes in there that I hope we'll get to return to over the course of the discussion today. So great. Susanna Schellenberg, can you go next?
Yeah, thank you also for organizing this, Dan. This is a great project that you're starting. Yeah, so currently my research is focused on issues at the intersection of AI, neuroscience, and philosophy. So I'm writing a series of papers on biased algorithms in AI, and a book on the neural basis of perception. And those two projects intersect in many ways, and they build on the book you mentioned, my book, The Unity of Perception. And I mean, the core idea of the book is that perception is fundamentally a matter of employing perceptual capacities. And I argue that perceptual capacities constitute perceptual content. And in my current research, I'm sort of taking I'm going a step deeper and trying to figure out, in collaboration with various neuroscientists, more about the neural basis of these perceptual capacities. And then with regard to biases, I'm working on a project about bottom-up biases that are distinct from top-down biases. So the idea being, top-down biases are biases that stem from beliefs, fears, desires, and various other mental states. So these kinds of biases have been studied extensively. They could be implicit or explicit, they could be conscious or unconscious. And we can contrast these kinds of these kinds of top-down biases from bottom-up biases, or I call them bottom-up biases, which are biases that are data-driven. I mean, they come from how recognitional systems, be they artificial or natural, operate at the lowest level. So in human vision, for example, we have the bias that light comes from above. That happens to be a really unproblematic bias. In fact, it's a good bias because it makes us process information much more efficiently. And every once in a while, it leads to mistakes. But for the most part, it's a beneficial bias because light almost always comes from above. But then there are other biases that are harmful. For example, the cross-race bias, the tendency to recognize people of groups, racial or ethnic groups with which one has interacted a lot, much more easily than others. And similarly in AI, you have biases. and I'm using bias here in a neutral way. So biases could be bad, but sometimes, so I'm using bias just in the sense that most scientists use bias as just a question of weighting. And whenever you have a recognitional system, be it artificial or natural, there's a big mismatch between processing power and the data that needs to be processed. And so whenever you have such a mismatch of processing power and data to be processed, you're going to have biases, unfortunately. And then the question is how to keep the ones that are innocuous while removing the ones that are problematic. And it turns out in AI, there are a lot of deeply problematic biases that don't just replicate existing biases in our society, but amplify them. I can say more about that later.
Yeah, great. Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah, so really fascinating set of issues on the table already that I hope we'll get to pick up on. So Ned, can you hop in here and say a little bit about your current work and what's brought you to that work even after or at the current time?
Yeah, so I have two main projects. One of them, as you mentioned before, I'm finishing up a book on the perception cognition difference. So I'm arguing for differences in format and content and type of state. The main difference between what I'm doing on this and I think stuff that has come before is I'm appealing to experimental evidence, and I'm trying to describe how experiments in psychology and neuroscience can clarify the difference, and also the difference between high-level perception and low-level perception, the high level being the rich perception that Susanna mentioned. So that's one project, which I'm winding up now and I'm almost done with. The other one is my sort of ongoing interest in things to do with in consciousness. And there I have a couple of separate projects. One where I'm collaborating with scientists. So I just had an article with two scientists that came out in the Journal of Neuroscience, talking about brain stimulation, trying to distinguish between cognitive theories of consciousness and what you might call purely perceptual theories of consciousness. And this is correlated with the difference between activity in the prefrontal cortex and activity in perceptual areas. And I'm also part of a group that's doing experiments on this topic. Dave Chalmers and I are two of the three co-directors of a Templeton World Charities Foundation grant, together with a number of scientists on this. We're designing experiments, and the experiments are underway. And I'm also part of a group of four people, three of whom are scientists, on writing a paper on probabilistic perception.
Fantastic, great, thank you. So unsurprisingly, I find this an incredibly exciting set of topics. A couple of things that really stand out to me are, one, just sort of the complex and multifaceted engagement of the philosophical work here with the sciences, and then also this connection of our perception to our broader social world and our thoughts and so forth. So hopefully we can hit on both of those things a little bit. The next place I wanted to go, actually, and several of you have already introduced this a little bit, was just to ask you a little bit about how you view the intersection between different philosophy and the sciences at this point. So there was a time where I feel like philosophy was very much sort of in its own lane and maybe sort of employing or taking results from the sciences, more or less as read. But one of the things that strikes me is the sort of rich interconnections that you all have described between philosophy and psychology and neuroscience. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of the role that you see the sciences playing in your sort of day-to-day philosophical work, and sort of how it affects your methodology qua philosopher. Susanna Schellenberg, do you mind actually getting us started on this? Because I was interested in your early work. There's a way of reading sort of like debates about perceptual objects as themselves a little bit removed from the details of psychology and neuroscience. But I'm specifically interested in how you're linking up this idea of perceptual capacities with what you're seeing in the sciences. Can you say a little more about that?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I'm currently co-authoring several papers with neuroscientists on perceptual discrimination and perceptual attribution, among other things, actually arguing against Ned Block with various scientists as my allies. We'll see how that goes. So I actually spent 2 years studying neuroscience recently, funded by a Mellon New Direction Fellowship that sort of allows you it pays your salary and allows you to just take classes again. So that was a really fantastic opportunity. And I mean, you mentioned perceptual capacities. So perceptual capacities have a prominent history in philosophy, but in the last 80 years or so, actually maybe longer, with notable exceptions, they've been largely neglected. And by contrast, for various reasons, partly I think due to Chomsky's influence and others, appeal to mental capacities and perceptual capacities in particular is standard in cognitive psychology and brain sciences. And there are lots of advantages to analyzing the mind in terms of capacities, and sort of a very sort of large-reaching goal of my research is to bring back capacities as a way to analyze the mind, but informed by solid work in neuroscience and cognitive psychology. And just to say a bit more about the advantage, so an advantage of analyzing the mind in terms of capacities is that it allows for a counterfactual analysis of mental states on 3 interrelated levels. On one level, you can talk about the function of capacities. On a second level, you can talk about those capacities being employed irrespective of the context in which they're employed. And then on a third level, you can talk about the capacities employed, taking into account the environmental context in which they're employed. And that allows for really, it allows for a framework to analyze the mind in ways that are, I believe, deeply beneficial to understand the mind more generally.
I was muted. So you also both mentioned sort of collaborating with scientists. Can maybe you and Ned also say a little bit more about sort of maybe the benefits and challenges of actively collaborating with psychologists and neuroscientists? It strikes me as a great idea, but not necessarily always easy, right? Because you have to take sort of abstract philosophical ideas and get them, gussy them up into a form where you can actually address them. So maybe Ned, can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah. So what I have found is that actually there's a huge overlap of interests among scientists and philosophers. In my view, the hardest parts of the sciences are the parts where the concepts are really very unclear, like the concept of probabilistic perception. And this, the standard skills of philosophers are well adapted to analyzing those concepts or distinguishing between different pictures of different ways of understanding those concepts. And at the forefront of the sciences, there's always these conceptual questions. And if philosophers learn up enough of the material, they can really be very useful in helping to clarify and also to plan experiments. So No, I think there are lots of areas of psychology, notably cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, where these kinds of collaborations have gone on for years. You know, Frank Kyle, 20 years ago, used the natural kind literature in philosophy to actually do experiments on children's and adults' natural kinds, and Susan Carey has also applied a lot of philosophy to her work in cognitive development. And there has been less of there's been less actual interest in the philosophy by neuroscientists, but I think that's happening now as they see that many of the issues that they're interested in really kind of have fingers in the ways philosophers think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it always has struck me that the science can go on without philosophy, right? So in a sense, scientists need to see some buy-in from philosophers, and the willingness to train yourself up as a philosopher on the scientific methods as well, and then you can get these kind of rich interactions. So Susanna Siegel, how about you? So you're kind of famous for the argument from phenomenal contrast, right? Which is an argument that works at the phenomenal level. Can you say a little more about how maybe some of your thinking about higher level content is informed by, or also your new project on mental flow is intersects with areas of psychology and/or neuroscience?
Yeah, and I just echo, Ned's point that there are always conceptual questions that are at the heart of an investigation. And I mean, I think the best contemporary example of that, maybe the biggest contemporary example of that, is really this huge, growth of literature on probabilistic analyses of mental processes, with the Jakob Hovey's work and Tenenbaum's work, and so many philosophically minded experimentalists, Tenenbaum's group and other people working on those issues. And yet, the question of like how experience relates to the probabilistic processing is something I've thought a lot about. I published a paper last year called How Do We Experience Uncertainty? That's not exactly what it's called. Called something like that. Something like that. I can't remember the title of my paper. The perceptual experience of uncertainty. You're gonna have to edit this one. In mind and language, and that was about whether perceptual experience itself can be analyzed as some kind of probabilistically structured state. So that's a kind of question that philosophers first asked. John Morrison and Jesse Munton asked that question, and they wouldn't ask that question if there hadn't been so much seeming evidence that actually there's so much probabilistic processing leading up to consciousness, and then there's obviously lots of probabilistic processing that takes perceptual experiences as input. And so then that question arises of, is there some non-probabilistic little island, right in the middle in the sea of a big stream of probabilistic processing on either end of it? So I actually argue that there is basically an island in a sea, but it does raise the fantastic question of, what our experiences of uncertainty actually are. In what ways can we experience uncertainty? So that's the question I was trying to address, but that's an example of how you had all these experimentalists kind of walking around saying, just as if it was some fact they had discovered, that perception is probabilistic and conscious perception is conscious, perception is probabilistic, so conscious perception is probabilistic, and then that was that, and then we were here to say like, oh, wait a minute, let's just think about for a moment what that would mean. So I found that incredibly, productive and interesting. In terms of the phenomenal contrast argument, Ned a long time ago was kind enough to write a critical piece on the contents of visual experience, my first book back in 2010, and I always liked that piece for showing that the contrast argument actually is not an a prioristic argument. I mean, what it does is it's a structure for arguing. So it says, the philosophical part is just as theoretical as every experiment is. Every experiment has a theoretical element where you're posing a question and then figuring out the experimental means by which you can try to address it. So the contrast is like the question. The contrast is what's going to explain this contrast. The contrast is the subject matter. And then the method is just a kind of structure where you say, well, once you find a contrast that's a very good contrast for posing this question of what explains the contrast, that's when you get these alternative hypotheses. I systematize those hypotheses in various ways, saying, is it a raw feel, or is it a content, or is it a low level content, or is it something else? But but in terms of the reasons you might look to for why it might be one or the other of these alternatives, that's absolutely a place where, as Ned showed, you could appeal to experiments to try to decide between the hypotheses. And it could happen that somebody says that I left out an option or something when I went over what all the options were. But so far, and it's been, now it's been over a decade, I've never actually seen anybody point to some other option that I hadn't identified. What I've seen was a whole bunch of incredibly ingenious and illuminating defenses of one or another option, like Ned gave. So that's one sort of point of contact. And it's interesting that it's unlike the probabilistic case. In the probabilistic case, you had all this work in probabilistic perception that actually set an agenda for philosophy, though they didn't know that's what they were doing, but they were doing that. Whereas here it was the other way around. It was like some philosophers were sitting around, thinking, talking about perception, and then that kind of posed a question which you could look to experimental work to answer. So I think those are two different ways in which experimental work and philosophy can interact.
Yeah, can I add something on the probabilistic perception, which is that the articles that started philosophers, the first philosophy articles in recent times on this were one by John Morrison and also by Jesse Munton. And then a psychologist, Rachel Dennison, replied to Morrison's paper. And I think that at the time she was a postdoc in Marissa Carrasco's lab here at NYU. And I think that really got the, people thinking about those issues in a better way.
Yeah, great, thanks. I mean, there's a lot of good examples here of sort of the many different kind of directions from which the interaction can go, right? So whether it be someone having a philosophical view and sort of going to work in the sciences and thinking about that view, or the sciences themselves coming up with a theory and philosophers picking up and sort of using that as, I don't want to say fodder, but as a source for rich sort of philosophical theorizing. I think the range of topics brought up here really did a good job of kind of like showing how rich those potential interactions are, and I think that's a really rich and useful thing to have in mind. Susanna says, how can perceptual experiences explain uncertainty? If anyone is interested, is the title of her paper from a couple years ago. Okay, great. So I mean, the next thing I wanted to ask, and maybe we can, maybe we've done this enough already, was kind of just how is it different being a philosopher of perception now than it was sort of at the beginning of your careers? I mean, so Ned, I was going to ask you to start with this, but it seems to me even in so I started grad school in 2008, and it seems to me even in my career there's been a lot of change to just kind of maybe the diversity of projects that you might be working on under broadly the aegis of philosophy of perception or perceptual representation. So maybe that's one way to think about it, is just sort of like openness to distinct kinds of projects and so forth. But I was wondering how you all kind of thought about this. Is that one way of putting it, or is there more to it? Ned, do you mind if you want to get us started?
Well, okay, so I am by far the oldest person here.
I picked you at random.
So at the beginning of my career, philosophers celebrated how little they knew of the sciences. We don't have to know anything. We can just do it without knowing anything. Thankfully, that attitude really is a much less common, and especially in philosophy of perception, where my wife who's a cognitive development psychologist, reports having a conversation with someone at a table where she asked him what he did. He said he did philosophy of perception, and so she said, "Well, you must be very interested in the psychology of perception." And he said, "I've always planned to learn a little bit about that, but I've never gotten around to it." Susanna Siegel will know who I'm talking about.
Can I just say that Ned changed the field this way? I mean, at the beginning of my graduate school, which was in the early 90s, at least where I went to graduate school was at Cornell. At the time, it was people who were kind of trained in this ordinary language tradition in which perception was not a topic for philosophy of mind. It was a topic in epistemology,
Yep.
and then it was a topic in psychology, but there was no philosophy of perception as a topic in the philosophy of mind. And it was during the 90s when people began to study color that it became a topic in the philosophy of mind. And the way that there came to be more openness and continuity with the sciences was due to Ned twice over. One, in the literature on color, bringing to bear, the science of color, but also in the study of consciousness that, Ned drew distinctions that, between phenomenal and access consciousness that became legible to scientists and became legible to philosophers and really became this bridge. But you were an outlier then. You were an outlier. You were like the guy who, always talked about science, but somehow, you somehow escaped this criticism of like, that's not really philosophy because, it was just undeniably philosophy. And so, it shows that there can be sort of key bridge figures at key moments that really completely change the standards of a field. And it's even in my lifetime, it's really completely different. And that's been a major change. And from your generation, Dan, you don't see it. You don't see the contrast because that's how normal it is. But even just, not that just a decade or so ago, it was still, you could easily go to graduate school and have an advisor who had the sort of attitude that Ned's describing and reporting, and some people still do. And frankly, like some of the topics in philosophy perception, very hard to get people to feel the force of in really any other field. They just don't really get how it might, it's hard to get, it can be very hard to get one's mind around like the stakes or the import or the upshots of these debates about the ultimate metaphysical structure of experience. It's not to say it's not a question, it's just that it's a kind of question that has fewer interfaces than some of the other questions in the philosophy perception have.
So I should say though,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Susanna. I want to get your thoughts on this. Yeah.
I think there's also been, I agree with everything that Ned and Susanna Siegel were saying. And I think there's also been a shift more recently in what empirical areas there's a lot of interaction with in philosophy. So I think for quite a while, again, with notable exceptions, there's been much more interaction between philosophy and cognitive psychology than between philosophy and neuroscience. I think that's due in part, I think there are a lot of reasons for this. One is that, neuroscience, one is a positive reason, like neuroscience has just boomed in the last 10 years. And so naturally there's more interesting work that, we will be interested in. But there are also reasons coming from the philosophy side that I think, the idea that the mental states, the mind, perceptual states are multiply realizable, sort of made at least some philosophers draw the conclusion that, while we obviously should be interested in computational ideas and cognitive psychology, we don't need to be interested in sort of the actual physical implementation. And I think that's changed in many ways, partly because, of course, neuroscience isn't just the physical implementation. Neural processing, encodes information. Sorry, I have a very active cat here. Encodes information. And so there isn't this sort of neat distinction between the physical and the information processing level, as we all learned there is. Of course, you can make that distinction, but it's sort of much more intertwined. And neuroscience studies the way those things are intertwined. And to add to the course of areas in which we can really learn a lot from empirical fields, and I think especially neuroscience. So in addition to the projects I mentioned, I'm working on a project on spatial perception, and specifically subjective perspectives in perception, but also beyond perception. My home is perception, but I don't just stick there. And that's an area which, philosophers have a lot to say, but boy, there is really interesting research that just constrains the options about how the brain, generates I mean, to put it very sort of crudely, perceptual states of a 3D world from 2D projections. That simplifies over a lot of detail, but, and that, I think it's pretty hard to say interesting things about, topics in spatial perception without being very knowledgeable about, for example, that research among many other research.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I sort of like constraining, but also affording certain kinds of things in philosophical theorizing is one way that I've always kind of thought of it, right? Here's some kind of, some empirical hypotheses that can constrain one's theorizing, but also, encourage you to think in a new way that maybe philosophically we haven't thought before. Is one way that I've always thought that is a productive form of interaction. Yeah, so thanks for that. Ned, were you going to hop back in as well?
Yeah, I want to say something slightly reactionary, which is that while all this collaboration between philosophers and scientists is great, I think it's really important for philosophers doing this kind of collaboration to keep the philosophical issues front and center. I know I've had people say, why do I have to learn all this philosophy and stuff like that? And boy, I have no sympathy with that. And I also think that there is a danger for for philosophers who get too immersed in the sciences that they kind of lose sight of the philosophical issues. So yeah, I just want to make that caution.
Yeah, I want to
add a quick thing to that.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Susanna Siegel, go ahead.
Just a quick thing is that in a sense, the philosophers are always setting the agenda for the philosophical issues. And if we're not doing that, then it doesn't really end up being a productive interface. And even if the subject matter is given to us, as I think it really was in the probabilistic perception example, none of the experimentalists asked with any clarity whether perceptual experiences were probabilistic. It took a lot of philosophy to even clarify what that question was asking before we could go on to address it.
Susanna Schellenberg, you want to hop in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Ned was saying, which is that I think there are all kinds of bad ways to do work in philosophy while being highly informed by empirical research. And one is that philosophy just becomes some kind of journalistic enterprise where we report what empirical researchers have discovered. That's not very interesting. And there's lots and lots of good ways to do it. And I think Ned is who's been doing this longer than any of us. I mean, doing philosophy in ways that is deeply informed by empirical research in a range of different areas of empirical research. I mean, there are lots of different ways to do that that contribute both, in deep ways to philosophy, and on the other hand, also contribute to those empirical fields.
Yeah, great. So this actually all leads into, I'm going to skip around on my own outline here a little bit, but this really leads to a question I wanted to ask you all. In terms of thinking about young people getting into the field, we've talked about all this, these rich potential for topics and specifically topics working in interaction with the sciences, and I was kind of thinking, what is the right way to approach this now very complex, interactive, interdisciplinary field, maybe as something like a first-year graduate student or something. So, I mean, one of the things I've picked up is, having the philosophical chops, but also learning the relevant sciences in a way that you can kind of embody that productive interaction, which of course requires both sides of the coin. Would anyone like to add anything about sort of like avenues that might be particularly exciting for young people getting into the field, or advice about how to approach this particular set of methodological opportunities that we're kind of faced with these days?
Well, I think one thing we haven't mentioned yet is that there's been sort of a social political turn in many areas of philosophy, like philosophy of language, metaphysics, epistemology, and also philosophy of mind, a little bit slower. And I think, I mean, what I've seen, at least at Rutgers, is that, you know, graduate students are working in philosophy of mind are much more interested in the sort of social political aspects of issues having to do with mental states. And I think that's, you know, there's a lot of very interesting work to be done in that area. And that requires, you know, not just empirical knowledge, but also knowledge of issues having to do with biases, social cognition, and, you know, the way we gather evidence and so forth.
Yeah, that's
So it's hard. There's a lot to learn these days.
yeah. It just gets more and more as time goes along, it seems like. Does anyone else have thoughts on the you know, new student coming into the field, kind of how they should think about things?
Point about social and political topics in the philosophy of mind, which is that I think that that kind of interface is a little different than, and calls for a different type of intellectual attitude and approach than the interface we were talking about before with the experimental sciences, even if one is reading experimental social science, in that you know, the big difference, the big continuity between neuroscience and philosophy, despite all the other differences, is that we're not talking about, you know, events that happen at specific places and times, you know, in history and anything like that, just studying the mind and the aspects that don't change except perhaps over evolutionary time. Whereas when we start to talk about social and political matters, it's really, you know, incredibly important to be able to be legible to and knowledgeable about fields that do study things that happen at specific places and times. And, you know, the kind of Anglo-analytic tradition that all three of us were, you know, grew up in and were trained in, you know, is very much insulated from any of that kind of inquiry, any kind of social inquiry, any kind of historical inquiry. But once we start talking about social relationships, and, you know, bias is a great example, it's just not possible to understand the social phenomenon if you come to it viewing it as a problem that's just like any other problem in science. I mean, there is a bias as a category in psychology, as Susanna, you know, Schellenberg said, and it's important to understand the nature of that. And but if we want to understand the kind of social and political manifestations of it, I would advise someone who is interested in those things, you know, not to shy away from disciplines that are actually intellectually quite more distant from philosophy than philosophy is from neuroscience. In that, you know, it's very useful to know about things, and you can't not know about things that happen at specific places and times. You need some sort of historical reference. You need some sense of the history of political thought, you know, in one or another tradition. So I think that's a really big difference, that we shouldn't kind of lump together every kind of interdisciplinarity because they call for totally different things.
One thing that you know, that I think a beginning person has to realize is that there's a cost to mastering these fields. You know, it makes philosophy of mind much more like philosophy of physics or ancient philosophy, where you have to master languages and texts. That just, you know, it's an added you know, set of courses and work that you have to do. I think increasingly, though, philosophers really have to master not just philosophers of mind, but almost every field of philosophy now requires some knowledge base, you know, in another department. You know, people in ethics have to do a lot of, you know, economics, or depending on what ethics and political philosophy, they need to know stuff. And so, you know, it makes philosophy harder than it used to be, I think.
Yeah, and I just like to add to that I think it's important to also note that it used to be, like a long time ago, several hundred years ago, that philosophy and the sciences were extremely intertwined, even more so than they currently are. And so this idea that, you know, this is a new thing we're doing, looking at neuroscience and so forth, is, I think, false. I mean, it used to, for a while, be completely out of fashion, as as Ned said a while ago, and people took pride in knowing nothing about the sciences. But the way things currently are, that we all have to gain that knowledge base of the sciences, is the way things used to be, for example, in the era of Kant, Locke, and Hume. And so I think in some sense there was sort of an exception to the rule for roughly 100 years, and now we're going back to the way things should always have been.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. And I think, to be honest, I think they're also kind of like institutional upshot for this attitude, right? So we're always hearing about how the liberal arts are sort of under attack in many different ways. And I've always thought, I would, maybe you all can advise me otherwise, but I've always thought sort of like removing philosophy from its far distant, like shady corner of the campus, right? And having active intersections with other disciplines, whether they be in the sciences or fields analyzing social phenomena, is kind of, in a sense, a way to if not reinvigorate, but at least sort of plug philosophy into the broader intellectual world. And that has always struck me as a nice thought, not a scary thought.
Yeah, and at Rutgers, like everyone working in philosophy of mind and everyone working in philosophy of language gets a cognitive science certificate, which is essentially like a master's in cognitive science. And so all our courses are cross-listed there. So, and I think that's the case in, I mean, there's similar features in many different universities. So yeah, I 100% agree.
Yeah, great. Well, so, and I guess, we've kind of been dancing around this a little bit. I want to, in the discussion of the way that philosophers of mind might intersect with kind of social political issues, I wanted to kind of end today by asking, do we have a responsibility to be involved in public issues? Do we have to put it another way, is there a specific thing that philosophers can offer to public discourse surrounding this topic and others, where the philosophy of mind issues end up intersecting with important social issues of the time? Is that a bridge too far? Am I being idealistic there, or do you all see a real possibility for that sort of thing?
Well, I should mention that Susanna Siegel has been writing a lot of articles, including a recent one in the LA Review of Books, using philosophical tools to explore social issues.
Yeah, so maybe Susanna, can you say a little bit about how you got into that, and why you are there other particular challenges you find with that? What is rewarding about that kind of work?
Well, the piece Ned mentioned is in a series called Histories of Violence, which is actually edited by a philosopher, Brad Evans, who does interviews with various thinkers from all disciplines about one or another aspect of violence. And I ended up writing about mob violence as a sort of dimension of the project on perceiving the public that I mentioned at the beginning. And it's incredibly rewarding. I mean, I find I use my teaching voice because the public is a different public than it is when I'm writing, how can perceptual experiences explain uncertainty, very different public. And they're all, I mean, you put the question in a way that made me, hesitate to answer it in the way that you may have expected me to, when you said, do we have a duty to talk about public issues? We have to take our resources and then put them over there. I don't know if I quite put it that way. I mean, I think everybody has some sort of, duty or sort of interest, and interest, whether they recognize it or not, in political engagement of some sort. And of course, it's a philosophical question in its own right, what that looks like or should look like or can look like at a given time and place. That's got nothing to do with philosophy. That's just got to do with belonging to a polity, being in a place at a time. But it is possible, just as we all teach, we all teach people, we all speak to people who are beginners with one topic or another, and we all know the pitfalls that surround trying to do that but not communicating well. So we're actually pretty practiced in in speaking to wider audiences, and I find it incredibly fun. And in this case, the piece Ned mentioned, it was an interview. There are 3 or 4 topics, and it's sort of efficient. It was like an efficient way to work on a philosophy paper. In that case, I mean, I've also written some op-eds, which are also, I'd say, in sort of a teaching voice that one explored hypocrisy, one explored Schadenfreude. These are sort of topics in moral psychology, but connected, because they came up to to specific, current events and stuff. I mean, I enjoy it. I don't know. I'm not saying it's like I'm somehow doing more of a duty than anybody else is, but sure, it's possible. It's always possible. It's always possible to take a topic and explain it clearly. I mean, what you need is an excuse for talking about it. I mean, that's what you couldn't sort of write an op-ed about probabilistic perception, really. I mean, maybe somebody could, but it's just like, what would be the occasion? You have to sort of talk people into it. And so we're used to the kind of teaching where, because what we're directing people to is a philosophical problem that even people engaged in a certain subject matter wouldn't recognize. Like even people who are trying to study consciousness might not recognize the distinction until Ned drew it between phenomenal and access, or the hard problem. We needed a philosopher to articulate it in a way that people could get their minds around it as a problem. So, the whole nature of philosophical problems, so they're always there, they're always implicit. Sometimes you can get around them, like the mathematician doesn't need to know what numbers are to do math, but that doesn't stop there from being a question about what they are. So if you're writing for the public, it's a little bit of a different bar, because it's not like, all right, public, guess what? There's this problem, and I'm going to tell you about it. I mean, that's kind of philosophy 101. It's not quite the same thing. Whereas if it's that, everywhere in political discourse, you find people accusing each other of hypocrisy, and it seems to be cutting short substantive political dialogue, perhaps there's something to explain there. So I don't think there's any kind of recipe for it. But in terms of my own, writing, I just was struck by what was happening and decided to write about it. It was kind of simple as that.
Yeah, great. I think, yeah, so I probably overstated it, but I think a better way of putting it is maybe where there are opportunities, right? Where there's a chance for a particularly philosophical analysis to make sense of an issue that's in the public, and maybe we should. Well, the way to think about it is be on the lookout maybe for specific opportunities in that regard. Sorry, Ned, go ahead.
So a long time ago, with the publication of the Bell Curve, I wrote an article on heritability and IQ and stuff like that, and there was a case where some philosophers' distinctions, I think, really made could help in that debate. I haven't really seen a case like that since, but I think philosophers really do have to keep their eye on what's going on in the public, and often a philosopher can really make some make some good points. I think. I would like to be doing more of this than I am.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, there's also an issue of incentive structures too, right? This is not something we normally encourage graduate students to do, for instance, but
we should.
And I personally have noticed a shift a little bit in sort of how much enthusiasm and encouragement there is for public engagement. Actually, another one of these roundtables is going to be on public philosophy, so tune in a few weeks when that one gets published. Susanna Schellenberg, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I have just one experience of writing public philosophy, which was a piece on biased algorithms, and it was really rewarding to do that. It's also just a very different kind of writing, and but I think it's well, I think like Susanna Siegel, I wouldn't say that there's any duty to do public philosophy, but I think we have a lot to contribute in just clearly analyzing what's at stake. And there's been a range of different topics where philosophers have done that, polarization, and I mean, it's an endless list. And I think these are really valuable contributions that we are extremely well positioned to make. And I think we should choose jump on every opportunity that we have to make them and encourage our students to do so too. And I think in this respect, there's been a huge shift in the profession in that I would say, I mean, the time frame is a bit fuzzy, but like 10 years ago, if anything, it might have hurt people academically to do public philosophy, whereas now I would say, a graduate student who has published some public philosophy pieces, it would help them a lot, because it shows that they're engaged with current affairs, and that's a good thing.
When I was an assistant professor, getting close to coming up for tenure, my department chair, Richard Cartwright, took me aside and said, if you want to get tenure, you better do some more pure philosophy and not so much applied philosophy, which is the way he saw some of my IQ and heritability work. So I did. I don't think anybody would say that today, though.
Yeah.
I hope.
Okay. Well, so is there anything anyone would like to add? We're about at time for today. I want to thank you all. I found this really fun and really interesting, and I really enjoyed getting to talk to all of you. Looking forward to seeing the works in progress come out, and thank you all so much for joining today.
Well, thank you for doing this. Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
All right, thanks you all for being here, and thanks to everyone for joining in, and stay tuned for future iterations of Brains Blog Roundtables.